The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus Thompson pushed his cart down the empty corridor of Meridian Tech Tower. At 34, he moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to make himself invisible, his dark skin glistening slightly under the harsh office lighting. The building's silence at 2 a.m. was different from daytime chaos. No clicking heels, no ringing phones, just the soft whisper of his mop against marble floors. He wore his Navy janitor's uniform with the same dignity other men wore $1,000 suits, shoulders straight despite the weight of a double shift. His hands, scarred from an accident that ended his paramedic career 3 years ago, still moved with the precision of someone trained to save lives. Tonight, like every night, he was just trying to save his own. In his back pocket, a folded drawing from his 9-year-old daughter Zara showed a superhero with a mop instead of a cape. "That's you, Daddy," she'd whispered that morning, pressing the crayon masterpiece into his palm before school. Marcus smiled at the memory as he emptied another executive's overflowing trash can, wondering if these people even noticed the mess they left behind. Zara was everything. His motivation, his joy, his reason for enduring the condescending glances and whispered comments about the help. She never asked why Daddy cleaned buildings instead of saving people anymore. At 9, she simply believed her father was exactly where he needed to be. Her faith in him was both his greatest comfort and his deepest source of guilt. The injury had taken more than his career, it had shattered his sense of purpose. Marcus used to race toward emergencies, adrenaline pumping as he fought death for strangers' lives. Now he raced toward home, counting every dollar to make rent, praying Zara's school shoes would last another month. Some nights, when the building was particularly quiet, he could almost hear the echo of ambulance sirens calling him back to who he used to be. But medical bills from his accident had destroyed his credit, and certification renewal required money he didn't have. So he pushed his cart through hallways where executives made more in bonuses than he earned in 5 years, invisible to people who never learned his name. Yet Marcus carried himself with an unshakable dignity that no paycheck could define. He taught Zara that respect wasn't about titles or bank accounts, it was about how you treated people when no one was watching. Character, he'd tell her during their late-night homework sessions in the building's break room, is what you do when it costs you something. He lived those words every day, helping elderly security guards with heavy doors, covering shifts for co-workers with sick children, never complaining about the executives who left coffee spills and crumpled papers like breadcrumbs of disrespect. Tonight, as he cleaned the 32nd floor, where decisions about hundreds of jobs were made by people who'd never worried about grocery money, Marcus had no idea that in less than an hour, everything would change. Victoria Sterling's corner office on the 42nd floor was a monument to success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, awards gleaming under recessed lighting, and a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars. At 42, she commanded Sterling innovations with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a general, her perfectly styled auburn hair never showing a strand out of place even at this ungodly hour. The merger documents spread before her represented 18 months of negotiations, each page a masterpiece of corporate strategy that would eliminate redundancies and maximize shareholder value. She moved through the numbers with mechanical efficiency, red ink marking departments for restructuring, a euphemism that sounded cleaner than firing 300 people before Christmas. Her manicured fingers traced profit projections while the city slept below, unaware that their livelihoods hung in the balance of her midnight calculations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she worked in a building cleaned by people whose jobs she was about to eliminate. Victoria had built her empire by understanding that sentiment was the enemy of profit, that successful leaders made hard choices while others hesitated. She'd clawed her way from a working-class background in Detroit to the pinnacle of corporate America, shedding pieces of her soul with each promotion until she could look at employee ID numbers without seeing faces. The janitorial staff were line items in a budget, not people with families, dreams, or children who drew pictures of superhero dads. Her assistant had mentioned something about the night janitor's daughter doing homework in the break room, but Victoria filed that information away as irrelevant. Personal stories were distractions from the greater good of fiscal responsibility. The truth was that Victoria's success had come at a price she was only beginning to understand. Her penthouse apartment echoed with emptiness, filled with expensive furniture but devoid of laughter or love. She hadn't spoken to her sister in 2 years, had missed her nephew's birthday for a board meeting, and couldn't remember the last time she'd had dinner with someone who wasn't discussing quarterly projections. Her reflection in the office window showed a woman who had everything and nothing, power without purpose, wealth without warmth, respect without affection. The employees who feared her couldn't see the hollowness behind her confident facade, the way she sometimes stood in her empty kitchen at midnight, wondering if this was what winning was supposed to feel like. But tonight felt different, heavier somehow, as if the universe was holding its breath. Victoria signed page after page, her Mont Blanc pen sealing fates with surgical precision, unaware that in the basement garage, her own fate was about to intersect with that of a janitor whose job she'd just eliminated. She checked her Rolex, 2:30 a.m., and decided to call it a night, gathering the signed documents that would reshape hundreds of lives come Monday morning. As she walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the polished marble, Victoria Sterling had no idea that in 17 minutes her perfectly controlled world would explode into chaos. The woman who prided herself on anticipating every variable, planning for every contingency, was about to discover that some things, like grace, like heroism, like the courage of ordinary people, couldn't be calculated, predicted, or controlled. The underground parking garage held the kind of silence that comes just before dawn, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between concrete pillars. Victoria's Tesla hummed quietly as she descended the ramp, her mind still churning through merger calculations, already planning tomorrow's damage control when the layoffs went public. She was typing a text to her assistant when the steering wheel seemed to lock, the car veering sharply toward the support column at 40 miles per hour. Time fractured into slow-motion fragments, the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal against concrete, the spiderweb of cracks spreading across her windshield like a prophecy of destruction. The impact threw her forward, seatbelt cutting across her chest as her head snapped against the side window, stars exploding behind her eyes. Then came the smell, acrid, electrical, the distinctive scent of lithium batteries beginning to burn, smoke curling up from beneath the crumpled hood like incense at a funeral she hadn't planned to attend. 3 floors above, Marcus was finishing his shift when the building's structure shuddered almost imperceptibly. His paramedic instincts, dormant but never dead, recognized that vibration. Impact, significant force, probably vehicular. He abandoned his cart without thinking, muscle memory overriding 3 years of careful invisibility as he ran toward the stairwell. His work boots echoed against concrete as he descended, following the acrid smell that grew stronger with each floor. In the garage, he found Victoria's Tesla wrapped around the pillar like a metallic embrace, smoke beginning to pour from the battery compartment in earnest now, the kind of electrical fire that could turn a luxury car into a crematorium in minutes. Through the spiderweb driver's side window, he could see her slumped form, blood trickling from her forehead, unconscious and trapped, while death counted down in degrees of rising heat. Marcus didn't hesitate, didn't think about liability or his own safety or the fact that this woman probably made more in a week than he did in a year. He grabbed the fire extinguisher from the emergency station, aimed it at the base of the flames to buy precious seconds, then attacked the jammed door with the kind of desperate strength that comes when someone's life hangs in the balance. The handle was bent, the frame warped from impact, but his scarred hands remembered how to work under pressure, how to find leverage when there seemed to be none. The door finally gave way with a metallic shriek of protest, and Marcus reached inside, his fingers checking her pulse, weak but steady, before carefully supporting her neck and shoulders. The fire was spreading now, orange tongues licking at the undercarriage, the Tesla's sophisticated safety systems no match for the fury of burning lithium, and Marcus knew they had maybe 30 seconds before the smoke turned toxic and the heat became unbearable. He pulled Victoria from the wreckage with the practiced efficiency of his former life, cradling her unconscious form against his chest as he carried her away from the burning car. His back screamed in protest, the old injury that had ended his paramedic career, but adrenaline masked the pain as he moved toward the emergency exit, her blood staining his Navy uniform, her expensive perfume mixing with the acrid smell of smoke and fear. Behind them, the Tesla's battery compartment erupted in a shower of sparks and flame, the explosion echoing through the garage like thunder in a cavern. Marcus didn't look back. He was already assessing her injuries, checking her breathing, his hands moving with the muscle memory of someone trained to fight death itself. As sirens wailed in the distance, someone must have heard the crash, triggered an alarm. Marcus Thompson, invisible janitor and discarded paramedic, held the unconscious CEO of Sterling Innovations in his arms and whispered the same prayer he'd said over countless strangers. "Stay with me, just stay with me." Victoria's eyes fluttered open like butterfly wings testing the wind, her vision swimming between smoke-hazed reality and the concerned face hovering above her. The first thing she noticed was the gentleness, strong arms holding her with the careful reverence reserved for something precious and fragile, not the clinical efficiency she might have expected from a paramedic. Her designer blazer was torn at the shoulder, her silk blouse stained with blood and soot, the armor of corporate perfection stripped away to reveal the vulnerable woman beneath. The man carrying her had kind eyes, deep brown and steady, framed by a face that spoke of quiet strength rather than heroic bravado. And she realized with startling clarity that this wasn't a first responder in uniform. This was someone in Navy coveralls with Marcus embroidered above the pocket. The acrid smell of burning electronics filled her nostrils as consciousness fully returned, along with the terrifying memory of metal crushing against concrete, of her carefully controlled world exploding into chaos in the span of heartbeats. Her throat felt raw from smoke inhalation, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper, but the words came anyway, unfiltered, unguarded, born from a vulnerability she hadn't felt since childhood. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her grey eyes searching his face for an answer that made sense in a world where strangers rarely risked themselves for others, especially when those others belonged to a different social stratosphere. "You don't even know who I am." The question hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross, weighted with assumptions about class and race and the invisible barriers that divided their worlds. She was Victoria Sterling, CEO worth 9 figures, a woman whose decisions shaped markets and whose name appeared in Forbes. And he was, what? A janitor, a maintenance worker, someone whose existence she'd never bothered to acknowledge despite working in the same building. The cognitive dissonance made her head spin more than the concussion, this reversal of fortune where the powerful found themselves powerless in the arms of the powerless. Marcus paused in his steps, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of her question, his arms still cradling her as sirens grew louder in the distance. He looked down at this woman, bloodied, vulnerable, stripped of her corporate armor, and saw not a CEO or a billionaire or even an employer, but something far simpler and infinitely more important. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, despite the pain shooting through his injured back, despite the surreal nature of holding his boss's boss in a smoke-filled garage. His words carried the weight of absolute certainty, not arrogance but truth distilled to its essence, the kind of wisdom that comes from raising a daughter in a world that constantly tries to define people by their circumstances rather than their humanity. "You're someone's daughter," he continued, each word deliberate and precise. "That's enough." The simplicity of his answer hit Victoria like a second collision, more devastating than the first because it shattered assumptions she didn't even know she'd been carrying. In her world, value was measured in stock options and market share, in quarterly earnings and shareholder returns. But this man, this stranger who risked his life for hers, saw her through a completely different lens. Someone's daughter. Not the CEO who'd just signed layoff papers, not the billionaire who lived in an ivory tower, not the corporate shark who devoured smaller companies for breakfast, but simply a human being deserving of rescue because her life had inherent worth. The tears that sprang to her eyes weren't from physical pain, but from a recognition so profound it felt like resurrection. When was the last time someone had seen her as just Victoria, not as a title or a net worth or a business opportunity? As Marcus carried her toward the approaching paramedics, Victoria Sterling realized that in saving her life, this janitor had somehow managed to save something even more precious, her faith in humanity itself. The hospital waiting room at 4 a.m. was a purgatory of fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs, the kind of sterile environment where time moved differently and truth had nowhere to hide. Victoria sat with a bandaged forehead and a hospital gown that made her feel more exposed than any boardroom ever had, watching Marcus pace near the vending machines with the restless energy of someone unaccustomed to sitting still. The police officer had been thorough in his report. Marcus Thompson, night janitor at Meridian Tech Tower, former paramedic, single father, no criminal record, and according to the employee database Victoria's assistant had pulled up, scheduled for termination in 72 hours as part of the operational restructuring she'd signed just minutes before her world exploded. The irony tasted bitter in her mouth, metallic like the blood she'd swallowed from her split lip. The man who'd risked his life to save hers was about to lose his livelihood because of her signature, a decision made in the abstract comfort of her corner office, where employees were numbers on spreadsheets rather than flesh and blood humans with mortgages and children and dreams that hung by the thread of a steady paycheck. Victoria approached him slowly, her designer heels replaced by hospital slippers that made no sound against the linoleum, carrying herself with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation, "I want to thank you properly." She reached into her purse, somehow retrieved from the wreckage along with her life, and pulled out her checkbook, the Mont Blanc pen that had signed his termination papers, now poised to write what she hoped might be adequate compensation for his heroism. "Please, let me give you something, a reward, a thank you gift. What you did tonight." Her words trailed off as she realized how inadequate they sounded, how corporate speak failed utterly in the face of genuine gratitude. She began writing zeros, her hand trembling slightly, not from injury, but from the strange discomfort of trying to quantify courage with currency. In her world, everything had a price: consulting fees, merger costs, golden parachutes. But sitting here in this harsh hospital light, she struggled to find the right number to express the value of her life. Marcus looked at the check she offered, then at her face, and something shifted in his expression, not anger exactly, but a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any rage could have. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child, "I appreciate the gesture, but I can't take that." He gestured toward the pediatric wing, where a few early shift nurses were beginning their rounds. My daughter Zara, she's asleep at my neighbor's right now, and when she wakes up, she's going to ask me about tonight. She's going to want to know why I helped someone, why I ran toward danger instead of away from it." His eyes met hers directly, unflinching, holding a conviction that made her feel simultaneously ashamed and enlightened. "I don't want her thinking kindness comes with a price tag. I don't want her growing up believing that doing the right thing is something you get paid for." The check remained suspended between them like a bridge neither could cross, her offering suddenly feeling less like gratitude and more like an insult to something sacred. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of hospital machinery and hushed conversations, but Victoria felt like she was hearing clearly for the first time in years. Marcus folded the check gently and handed it back to her, his calloused fingers briefly touching her manicured ones in a moment that felt more intimate than any business handshake ever had. "Besides," he added with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "heroes don't send invoices." Victoria stared at the returned check, seeing not just paper and ink, but a reflection of everything wrong with her worldview, everything broken about a system that taught her to believe human decency could be bought and sold like quarterly projections. As Marcus walked back toward the vending machines, probably buying coffee with coins, counted carefully from his pocket, Victoria Sterling, woman who could purchase small countries, realized she was holding worthless paper while the richest man she'd ever met walked away in second-hand work boots, carrying a wealth she'd never learned to recognize. 3 days later, Victoria Sterling did something she'd never done in her 15 years as CEO. She cancelled her morning meetings and drove to Meridian Tech Tower at 11 p.m., parking in the same garage where her life had nearly ended. Her hands still trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from the accident, but from what she was about to do. She'd spent 72 hours in her penthouse, staring at the layoff papers that remained unsigned on her desk, Marcus's words echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. The building felt different at night, stripped of its daytime energy and corporate bustle, revealing itself as simply a place where people worked to survive rather than a monument to her success. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, clothes that felt foreign after years of power suits, and moved through the lobby with the uncertain steps of someone entering a world she'd never bothered to notice. The night security guard looked surprised to see her. "Working late again, Ms. Sterling." But she just nodded, unwilling to explain that she wasn't here to work, but to understand. She found Marcus on the 38th floor, methodically cleaning conference rooms where executives had debated his termination over catered lunches that cost more than his weekly salary. Victoria watched from the shadows as he worked, noting the care he took with every task, straightening chairs with precision, cleaning whiteboards until they gleamed, emptying trash bins with the same attention to detail she demanded from her board presentations. What struck her most was his interaction with others, the way he checked on elderly Doris from the day shift who was running late, how he helped Miguel from maintenance carry heavy equipment, the gentle patience he showed when teaching the new security guard proper lockdown procedures. This wasn't just a job to Marcus. It was a calling, a way of caring for the building and its people that she'd never recognized from her ivory tower 42 floors above. His invisible presence kept this corporate machine running, and she'd been ready to discard him like outdated equipment without ever seeing his value. At midnight, Victoria witnessed something that stopped her breath entirely. Marcus sat in the break room with a small girl who couldn't have been older than 9. Her homework spread across the scratched formica table like a treasure map of multiplication tables and reading comprehension worksheets. This had to be Zara, the daughter whose faith in her father's heroism had prevented him from accepting Victoria's check. The child worked with intense concentration while Marcus wiped down nearby surfaces, but every few minutes he'd glance over, ready to help with a difficult problem or offer encouragement, when frustration crept across her young face. "Dad, why is long division so hard?" Zara asked, and Marcus sat beside her, explaining fractions with the same patience Victoria had seen him use with confused security guards. "Because," he said, "the important things usually are hard, but that doesn't mean we give up. We just break it down into smaller pieces until it makes sense." Victoria pressed herself against the doorframe, feeling like an intruder witnessing something sacred. A father raising his daughter to believe in persistence and hope despite circumstances that would crush most people's spirits. As she watched Marcus help Zara pack up her homework at 2 a.m. past any reasonable bedtime, but childcare didn't cover night shifts, Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, a fissure that let in light she'd been blocking for years. This was the man whose job she'd eliminated with a pen stroke, whose family stability she'd threatened with spreadsheet calculations, whose quiet heroism she'd tried to reduce to a monetary transaction. Zara gathered her books with sleepy efficiency, then hugged her father with the fierce love of a child who understood that her daddy worked while the world slept so she could have everything she needed. "I'm proud of you for helping that lady, Daddy," she whispered loud enough for Victoria to hear. "Mama would be proud too." Marcus kissed the top of his daughter's head, and Victoria saw him blink back tears he couldn't afford to shed, maintaining strength for a little girl who believed her father could fix anything broken in the world. As they walked toward the employee exit, Zara's small hand in her father's calloused one, Victoria Sterling realized she was witnessing real wealth, not the kind measured in stock portfolios, but the kind that built character, created legacy, and changed lives one small act of love at a time. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability, the boardroom filling with men in $1,000 suits who smelled of expensive cologne and entitlement. Victoria sat at the head of the mahogany table, the unsigned layoff documents spread before her like a legal execution warrant, while 12 board members waited for her to deliver the efficiency cuts that would boost quarterly profits by 18%. Harold Westbrook, the silver-haired chairman who'd mentored her rise to power, tapped his Mont Blanc pen impatiently against his leather portfolio, clearly annoyed by her uncharacteristic hesitation. "Victoria, we've been over these numbers a dozen times," he said, his voice carrying the condescension of old money addressing new success. "The janitorial contract alone will save us $2.3 million annually. These aren't people, they're line items. And sentiment doesn't pay dividends to shareholders." The other board members nodded in agreement, a chorus of corporate wisdom that had guided her career for 15 years. But their words felt hollow now, echoing in the space where Marcus's voice had taken residence. "You're someone's daughter. That's enough." Victoria stared at the papers, seeing not just employee ID numbers but faces, Marcus carrying his daughter's homework to work because childcare ended at 6, Doris staying late despite arthritic hands because she needed the overtime, Miguel sending money to his sick mother in El Salvador. Each signature would eliminate not just a job, but a family's stability, a child's sense of security, a parent's ability to provide basic necessities like food and shelter and medical care. "These restructuring cuts are industry standard," continued board member Patricia Chen, her own rise from poverty seemingly forgotten in the comfort of her corner office. "Every major corporation has implemented similar efficiency measures. We're already behind the curve on operational streamlining." The room buzzed with agreement, tablets and laptops displaying profit projections that painted job elimination as fiscal responsibility rather than human tragedy. But Victoria kept hearing Zara's sleepy voice. "I'm proud of you for helping that lady, Daddy. Mama would be proud too." How could she destroy the livelihood of a man who'd taught his daughter that heroism was helping strangers without expecting rewards? The silence stretched until Harold cleared his throat meaningfully, his patience clearly exhausted by what he perceived as uncharacteristic weakness from his protégé. "Victoria, if you're having second thoughts about tough decisions, perhaps we need to discuss whether you're still the right person to lead this company through necessary transitions." The threat hung in the air like smoke from burning wreckage. Familiar corporate intimidation designed to force compliance through fear of professional extinction. Around the table, 11 pairs of eyes watched her with the cold calculation of sharks sensing blood in the water, ready to devour her authority if she showed continued signs of what they'd call emotional compromise. But as Victoria looked at their faces, comfortable, insulated, untouched by the consequences of their decisions, she realized something profound had shifted in her definition of strength. True power wasn't the ability to destroy lives with a signature. It was the courage to protect them when everyone expected you to comply with conventional cruelty. Victoria stood slowly, gathering the unsigned termination papers with steady hands while her board watched in confusion and growing alarm. "You're right, Harold," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the earthquake she was about to trigger. "These are industry standard cuts, and that's exactly what's wrong with our industry." She walked to the window overlooking the city, where thousands of people worked in buildings cleaned by invisible hands, their lives dependent on decisions made by people who'd never learned their names. "Effective immediately, we're restructuring our restructuring. Instead of eliminating 300 jobs, we're creating efficiency through technology upgrades, executive compensation reductions, and operational improvements that don't require destroying families." The room erupted in protests and threats, board members demanding explanations for what they called financial suicide, but Victoria felt lighter than she had in years. As she walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of people who'd confused ruthlessness with leadership, she carried Marcus's lesson like a torch. Sometimes the most profitable decision is the one that preserves human dignity, and sometimes real strength means choosing grace over greed, even when it costs you everything. The financial press descended like vultures within hours of Victoria's decision, Bloomberg and CNBC running segments questioning her unprecedented reversal of established cost-cutting measures. The headlines were brutal. "Sterling CEO suffers post-trauma decision-making crisis," and board questions leadership after costly humanitarian gesture. Her phone buzzed incessantly, with calls from angry investors, threats from board members, and requests for interviews from journalists sensing blood in the water of corporate controversy. Harold Westbrook had already called an emergency session to discuss her mental fitness for leadership, while 3 major shareholders threatened to dump their holdings if she didn't immediately reverse what they called emotional decision-making that prioritizes feelings over fiduciary responsibility. Victoria sat in her corner office, watching her stock price drop in real time on her computer screen, each point representing millions in market cap evaporating because she'd chosen to see employees as human beings rather than expendable resources. The woman who'd built her reputation on ice-cold calculation was now being portrayed as unhinged, her moment of conscience twisted into evidence of psychological breakdown. But the real cost wasn't financial. It was personal. Her assistant quit, claiming she couldn't work for someone whose lack of business judgment endangered everyone's job security. 2 VPs submitted resignations, positioning themselves for opportunities at competitors who still understood that tough decisions require strong leadership. Victoria found herself increasingly isolated, eating lunch alone in her office while former allies whispered in hallways about her breakdown and post-traumatic stress affecting her judgment. The loneliness was crushing, but not unfamiliar. She'd been alone for years, just surrounded by people who mistook professional necessity for personal loyalty. What hurt more was the dawning realization that her entire social circle consisted of individuals who measured relationships in terms of mutual benefit, people who'd abandon her the moment she stopped being useful to their careers. In saving 300 jobs, she'd discovered how few real friendships she'd cultivated during her climb to the top. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own crisis 42 floors below. His supervisor, Carl Brennan, had pulled him aside with the uncomfortable news that rumors were circulating about his involvement with management decisions above his pay grade. Some co-workers whispered that he'd somehow manipulated the CEO's emotions to save his job, while others resented that the janitors had been spared when their own departments faced budget cuts. "People are talking, Marcus," Carl warned, clearly uncomfortable with the attention their department was receiving. "Upper management's asking questions about your interaction with Ms. Sterling. Maybe it's better if you keep your head down for a while." The irony was suffocating. Marcus had saved a life without knowing or caring about the professional consequences, but now found himself under scrutiny for heroism he'd never wanted to publicize. Worse, Zara had developed a heart murmur that required specialist consultation, medical bills that would strain their budget even with his job secure. But pride prevented him from seeking help from the woman whose gratitude he'd already refused. Friday evening found Marcus in the emergency room holding Zara's small hand while doctors explained that her condition required immediate intervention. Surgery that would cost more than he earned in 2 years, even with the insurance he barely afforded. Victoria's business card, pressed into his palm by a paramedic who'd heard about the rescue, felt like salvation and damnation simultaneously, a lifeline he was too proud to grasp, even as his daughter's future hung in the balance. In her penthouse, Victoria stared at the city lights, knowing nothing about Zara's condition, but feeling the weight of isolation that came from choosing principle over profit, conscience over career advancement. Both had paid prices for their intersection in that smoke-filled garage. She'd lost the respect of her professional world. He'd gained unwanted attention in his invisible one, but neither yet understood that their greatest challenges would forge their strongest bond, that sometimes the most expensive decisions ultimately prove priceless. Victoria discovered Zara's condition through the employee assistance program she'd never bothered to examine before, a file buried in HR documentation that revealed the human stories behind insurance claims and sick leave requests. Marcus Thompson, emergency room visit, pediatric cardiology consultation, daughter requiring surgical intervention for mitral valve repair, estimated cost $180,000, current insurance coverage insufficient. The numbers hit her like physical blows, each figure representing the impossible choice between her janitor's pride and his daughter's life. Victoria sat in her empty office at midnight, the same hour when Marcus cleaned these halls while his sick child slept, and realized she was staring at the exact scenario her layoffs would have created for 300 other families, medical crises that transformed working parents into desperate people choosing between medicine and rent, surgery and groceries. But this time, she had the power to change the equation, to offer help without the corporate distance that made charity feel like condescension. Monday morning, Victoria did something unprecedented. She took the elevator to the basement level and walked into the maintenance supervisor's office, asking to speak with Marcus Thompson about a security consultation. She'd rehearsed her words carefully, knowing that his pride was both his greatest strength and the barrier she needed to navigate with surgical precision. When Marcus appeared, still wearing his navy coveralls and carrying the quiet dignity that had impressed her in the hospital, Victoria felt nervous for the first time since her first board presentation 20 years ago. "Mr. Thompson," she began, then stopped, realizing how formal she sounded. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you, and I need you to hear me out completely before you refuse." She explained her need for a head of corporate security, someone with medical training who understood emergency response, crisis management, and human psychology. "It's not charity," she insisted when she saw the skepticism in his eyes. "It's recognizing that the right person was in the wrong role, and my company's been suffering because of my blindness." The position came with a salary that would cover Zara's surgery, health insurance that included specialist care, and responsibilities that honored Marcus's training rather than hiding it behind a mop handle. But more than that, Victoria offered him partnership in developing employee safety programs, crisis response protocols, and wellness initiatives that recognized workers as complete human beings rather than interchangeable parts in a corporate machine. "I don't want gratitude," she said, when Marcus began to speak. "I want expertise. I want someone who understands that a company's greatest asset isn't its profit margin. It's the people who believe in its mission enough to show up every day and do their best work." She pulled out a folder containing job descriptions, salary information, and benefit packages, laying them on Carl Brennan's desk, like blueprints for a different kind of future. "Your daughter needs surgery, and my company needs leadership that understands the difference between cost and value. This isn't rescue, it's recognition." Marcus stared at the papers, seeing not just a job offer, but a bridge between who he'd been and who he could become again. A chance to use his training to protect people rather than clean up after them. "Why me?" he asked quietly. The same question Victoria had posed in his arms as smoke filled the garage. Her answer came without hesitation. "Because you ran toward danger when everyone else would run away. Because you refuse payment for doing what's right. Because your daughter does homework in break rooms and still believes her father is a hero." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Take time to think about it. But know this. I'm not offering you this position because you saved my life. I'm offering it because you're exactly the kind of person I should have been looking for all along, and I was too blind to see past titles and degrees to recognize real leadership." As Victoria walked away, Marcus held the job description in hands that had once pulled strangers from burning cars and wondered if perhaps some rescues worked both ways, if sometimes saving someone else's life meant discovering you could still save your own. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of what was once Victoria's corner office, now transformed into the company wellness center, where Zara Thompson sat at a small desk doing her homework, while her father conducted safety training for executives who finally knew his name. The surgery had been a complete success, Zara's heart now beating strong and steady as she worked on math problems that no longer seemed quite so difficult. Marcus wore a tailored security uniform that commanded respect rather than invisibility, his badge reading Director of Corporate Safety and Emergency Response, a title that reflected not just his new role, but the company's new values. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the man who'd once cleaned these offices now taught the people who worked in them. But it felt like justice rather than revenge, correction rather than comeuppance. Victoria watched from the doorway as Marcus explained emergency evacuation procedures to the same board members who'd questioned her judgment 6 months ago. Men who now hung on every word from someone they'd once considered expendable. The company had flourished under what the press called Victoria's radical humanization of corporate culture, with productivity increasing 18%, not through layoffs, but through employee investment, retention rates improving dramatically when workers felt valued rather than threatened. Marcus had developed comprehensive safety protocols that had already prevented 2 potential disasters, his medical background proving invaluable when employees faced health crises, his understanding of human nature essential when developing policies that protected rather than penalized. But more than professional success, Victoria had discovered something she'd lost years ago. The ability to see her reflection in office windows without flinching, to make decisions that allowed her to sleep peacefully, to build something meaningful rather than merely profitable. The board members who'd threatened her removal had either learned to appreciate her new direction or found themselves replaced by directors who understood that sustainable success required sustainable ethics. Their relationship had deepened beyond gratitude and respect into something neither had expected to find again, love built on genuine admiration for each other's character rather than convenience or conquest. Victoria had learned to treasure quiet evenings, helping Zara with homework, while Marcus prepared security reports, discovering that domestic tranquility was more fulfilling than corporate dominance. Marcus had slowly opened his heart to the possibility that love didn't require perfection, that two broken people could create something beautiful together if they had the courage to be honest about their scars. They didn't live together yet, both too thoughtful about Zara's adjustment to rush important decisions, but they'd built a foundation of trust that promised permanence without demanding immediate transformation. Their love story had become legend in the building, whispered proof that extraordinary connections could emerge from ordinary moments when people chose to see humanity in each other. On this particular morning, as Zara finished her homework and Marcus concluded his training session, Victoria announced the expansion of their employee assistance program to include family medical coverage, childcare services, and educational scholarships, initiatives that Marcus had suggested and she'd embraced as sound business practice disguised as social responsibility. The same executives who'd once mocked her emotional decision-making now praised her innovative approach to employee retention and productivity optimization, their language adapting even if their understanding remained limited. But Victoria no longer needed their approval or their friendship. She'd found something more valuable in the quiet respect of a man who'd taught her that true strength meant lifting others up rather than climbing over them. As she watched Marcus gather his training materials while Zara packed her backpack, Victoria smiled at the beautiful complexity of their unusual family. 3 lives intersecting in ways that proved love could indeed emerge from the most unexpected places when hearts remained open to grace, courage, and the revolutionary idea that everyone deserves to be seen as someone's daughter, someone's father, someone worthy of rescue not because of their title or bank account, but simply because they're human. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the most ordinary moment, one person choosing to do what's right, not what's easy. Because heroes don't wear capes, they wear work boots, carry courage in calloused hands, and teach their children that kindness is the only currency that truly matters. Love doesn't always arrive in luxury cars or corner offices. Sometimes it comes in the form of someone willing to run toward your burning wreckage when everyone else walks away, someone who sees your worth when you've forgotten it yourself, someone who proves that the most valuable rescue is learning to see yourself through the eyes of someone who chooses to love you, not despite your flaws, but because of your fundamental humanity.